The world knows their names, Hatfield and McCoy. They've become a punchline, a cartoon of feuding hillbillies chasing each other with shotguns over a stolen pig. But on the first night of 1888, in the frozen darkness of the Tug Fork Valley, there was no laughter. There was only the smell of kerosene and the glint of rifle barrels in the moonlight as a war party surrounded a small family cabin. The goal wasn't robbery, it was extermination. They say it was all about a pig, or a Romeo and Juliet romance gone wrong. But the old-timers in these mountains and the dusty court records tell a different story. A story of Civil War wounds that never healed, of wealth and political power, and of a brand of Appalachian pride so fierce it would rather see a valley drenched in blood than surrender an inch. Today, we're not just telling the story, we're putting the legend on trial. We will find out what really happened on the Devil's Backbone and why this family war nearly became a real war between two states. Before the gunfire and the headlines, there was just the Tug Fork Valley, a rugged, isolated world carved between the mountains of West Virginia and Kentucky. The river itself was the lifeline and the boundary, a ribbon of muddy water separating two states and soon two families. In these hollows, life moved to an ancient rhythm of planting and harvest, of hard work and quiet faith. The forests were thick with timber and game, the creeks ran clear, and a family's wealth was measured not in dollars, but in the number of children they had and the loyalty of their kin. This was a world unto itself, governed by its own codes, where a man's word was his bond and his honor was worth more than his life. On the West Virginia side, the undisputed patriarch was William Anderson Hatfield, better known as Devil Anse. This was no simple-minded hillbilly. Devil Anse was a shrewd businessman who had built a successful timber operation, employing dozens of men. He was charismatic, fearless, and a natural leader. During the Civil War, he had led a Confederate guerrilla unit called the Logan Wildcats, earning a reputation for being as tough and unforgiving as the mountains themselves. He was a force of nature, a man who bent the world to his will, and his family, the Hatfields, were a powerful and respected clan. Across the river, in Kentucky, lived Randolph McCoy, or Randall. He was a different kind of man, older, leaner, and weathered by a life of farming. Where Anse was a booming presence, Randall was a quieter, more stubborn man, his pride rooted deeply in his land and his large family of 13 children. He, too, had served in the Civil War, but he had worn the blue of the Union Army. In a valley where allegiances were everything, this fact alone was a crack in the foundation of their community. For a time, this difference was just a quiet fact of life. The Hatfields and McCoys were neighbors, after all. They attended the same church picnics and harvest festivals. They traded livestock and did business together. There was even a Hatfield who had married a McCoy. They lived by the same mountain code, sharing a life that was both beautiful and brutal, a world that outsiders could never truly understand. They were two sides of the same coin, forged in the same Appalachian fire. But beneath the surface of this neighborly peace, a wound from the war had been left to fester. In 1865, Randall's brother, Asa Harmon McCoy, returned home after being discharged from the Union Army. A marked man in a region full of Confederate sympathizers, he was hunted down and killed by a band of ex-Confederate guerrillas. The leader of that posse was believed to be Jim Vance, Devil Anse Hatfield's own uncle and fiercest lieutenant. While Devil Anse was reportedly sick at home that day, the killers were his kin and his men. No one was ever arrested. For Randall McCoy, it was an unforgivable crime, a debt of blood that the law had ignored and the mountains had swallowed. The valley was calm, but it was the calm of a loaded gun. The Civil War was over on the battlefields of Virginia, but here, in the isolated heart of Appalachia, the resentments lingered. All it would take was a single spark, a stray pig, a careless word, a forbidden glance, to ignite a fire that would consume them all and turned this peaceful valley into a private battlefield. For 13 years, the valley sat on a powder keg left over from the war. The death of Asa Harmon McCoy was a wound that never closed for Randall, a quiet, bitter reminder of the justice he never got. The spark that finally lit the fuse came in the autumn of 1878, and it wasn't a bullet or a threat, but the grunting of a pig. Randall McCoy walked onto his property and accused his neighbor, Floyd Hatfield, a cousin of Devil Anse, of stealing one of his hogs. In a world where a fat hog could mean the difference between a hard winter and starvation, this was no small charge. But it was never about the value of the animal. It was about honor. It was a McCoy telling a Hatfield to his face that he was a thief. The dispute was taken to the local justice of the peace, Anderson Preacher Anse Hatfield. In an attempt at fairness, he assembled a jury of 6 Hatfields and 6 McCoys to hear the case. The makeshift courtroom, likely a small schoolhouse, was thick with tension. The fate of the pig, and perhaps the fate of the valley, rested on the word of one man, Bill Staton. He was related to both families, but everyone knew his loyalty lay with the Hatfields. Staton took the stand and swore that he had seen the pig and that it rightfully belonged to Floyd Hatfield. The jury was deadlocked until one of the McCoys, Selkirk McCoy, swayed by Staton's testimony, cast the deciding vote. The pig belonged to the Hatfields. For Randall McCoy, this was the ultimate betrayal. The law, run by a Hatfield and his own kin, had sided against him. He stormed out of the hearing, his simmering resentment boiling over into open rage. The system had failed him again. He was heard declaring that if he ever lost another pig, he wouldn't go to the law. He would handle it himself. This was more than a threat. It was a declaration of war against the Hatfield clan. The lines were being drawn not in the dirt, but in blood. The first of that blood was spilled less than 2 years later. Bill Staton, the man whose testimony had cost Randall his pig and his pride, was not a man to forget a grudge. One day, he got into a heated argument with 2 of Randall's nephews, Sam and Paris McCoy. The argument escalated quickly. Words turned to threats, and threats turned to action. In a flash of violence deep in a wooded hollow, guns were drawn. When the smoke cleared, Bill Staton lay dead on the forest floor. Sam McCoy had been shot and seriously wounded, but he would survive. Now it was a Hatfield who was dead, killed by McCoys. Sam McCoy was arrested and put on trial for murder, but he claimed self-defense. The trial was held in a Hatfield-controlled county in West Virginia. Citing the lack of evidence and the known animosity between the men, the court acquitted him. To the McCoys, it was justice. To the Hatfields, it was a slap in the face. A McCoy had killed one of their own and walked free. The cycle was now complete. A theft, a trial, a murder, and an acquittal. The courts were useless. From this moment on, the only justice either family would recognize would be delivered from the barrel of a gun. In the midst of this simmering hatred, something dangerous and beautiful bloomed. At a local election gathering in 1880, Devil Anse's son, John C. Hatfield, laid eyes on Randall McCoy's daughter, Rosanna. He was handsome and reckless. She was strong-willed and passionate. In the closed world of the Tug Fork Valley, their attraction was like a lit match tossed into a barrel of gunpowder. They fell into a whirlwind romance, ignoring the storm clouds gathering over their families. Rosanna, blinded by love, soon left her family's cabin to live with John C. among the Hatfields, a betrayal her father Randall would never forgive. But their love story was doomed from the start. John C., a known womanizer, soon abandoned the pregnant Rosanna for her own cousin, Nancy McCoy. Heartbroken and carrying a Hatfield's child, Rosanna was now an outcast, scorned by her own family and discarded by her lovers. She tried to return home, but her father's door was closed to her. She found shelter with an aunt, a woman alone, trapped between the 2 warring clans. Her story became a tragedy within a tragedy, a symbol of the innocence that was being crushed between the two great millstones of Hatfield and McCoy pride. The point of no return came on Election Day, 1882. In Kentucky, these were boisterous, drunken affairs where men from all over the hollows came to vote, trade, and settle scores. That day, a dispute over a fiddle ignited between Talbot-McCoy, one of Randall's sons, and Ellison Hatfield, Devalance's powerful, well-respected brother. Insults flew, fueled by moonshine and years of bad blood. The argument escalated into a brutal fistfight, and then, in a moment of fury, Talbot-McCoy pulled a knife. The festive air of the gathering curdled into horror. The crowd scrambled back as Talbot, joined by his two brothers, Farmer and Randolph Jr., set upon the lone Hatfield. The powerful frame of Ellison Hatfield shuddered again and again. He didn't cry out, but a look of profound shock crossed his face as he stumbled backward. A dark stain began to spread across the front of his shirt, then another and another. He collapsed into the mud of the clearing, gasping for air. The McCoy brothers stood over him, their faces a mask of rage, unaware that they had just sealed their own fates. Hatfield constables seized the three McCoy brothers, but instead of taking them to the jail in Pikeville, Kentucky, they dragged them across the Tug Fork River into West Virginia. They were now prisoners, not of the law, but of the Hatfield clan. When Devalance arrived and saw his beloved brother lying on a makeshift cot, riddled with 26 wounds, his response was cold and absolute. He made a vow. If Ellison died, the McCoy boys would die. For 2 days, the brothers were held captive while Ellison fought for his life. And then he breathed his last. That night, the McCoy boys were taken from their makeshift prison and marched to the Kentucky side of the river. They were tied to a series of pawpaw trees, their pleas for mercy swallowed by the darkness. There was no trial, no judge, no jury. There was only Devil Anse and a firing squad of his kin, their faces grim in the moonlight. The night was shattered by a single command. What followed was not a battle, but a ceremony of vengeance. A volley of gunfire ripped through the quiet valley, a sound so loud it seemed to shake the stars from the sky. The pawpaw bushes shuddered violently in the dark. And then an unnatural silence fell, broken only by the gentle lapping of the river against the bank. When the sun rose, it revealed a scene of chilling stillness. The dew on the grass around the pawpaw trees was dark, telling a story that needed no words. The silence that followed the pawpaw tree massacre was heavier and more terrifying than the gunfire itself. It was Randall McCoy's wife, Sarah, who found her sons. In the grey light of dawn, she saw the terrible stillness of the scene, a mother's worst nightmare made real under the drooping leaves of the pawpaw trees. The news spread like a sickness through the Kentucky hollows. 3 sons, executed without trial. Randall McCoy, a man already hardened by grief, seemed to turn to stone. The sorrow in his eyes was replaced by a hollow, burning void. He had followed the law with the pig, and it had failed him. Now, his sons were dead, and the law seemed a million miles away across the muddy waters of the Tug Fork. The funeral for the 3 McCoy brothers was a grim affair. The entire Kentucky side of the valley mourned, not just for the boys, but for the peace that had been shattered forever. The caskets were lowered into the cold Kentucky earth, and with them, any hope of reconciliation. Randall McCoy now had a singular, all-consuming purpose: justice. Not the rough justice of the mountains, but the cold, hard justice of the law. He went to the courthouse in Pikeville and swore out warrants against Devalance Hatfield and 20 of his kin and allies, including his sons. The charge was murder. Indictments were officially issued. The names of the Hatfield clan were now wanted posters, but the warrants were little more than paper. The Tug Fork River was more than a boundary. It was a sanctuary. In West Virginia, the Hatfields were powerful. They had friends in the law, friends in politics. They were seen not as murderers, but as men who had simply administered a brutal but necessary form of mountain justice. West Virginia authorities refused to recognize the Kentucky warrants. Devil Anse and his men were untouchable, living freely just a stone's throw from the state that wanted them hanged. For 5 long years, a tense and bitter Cold War settled over the valley. The warrants became legal ghosts, a source of constant frustration for the McCoys and a point of defiant pride for the Hatfields. The feud might have faded into a stalemate of simmering resentment if not for the arrival of a new, powerful player, Perry Cline. A sharp and ambitious Pikeville lawyer who was married to a McCoy, Cline had his own deep-seated grudge against Devil Anse over a bitter land dispute years earlier. He saw an opportunity to use the power of the state to settle a personal score. Cline used his political influence to go over the heads of local law enforcement. He lobbied the governor of Kentucky, J. Proctor Knott, convincing him that the honor of the state was at stake. Governor Knott agreed. He announced a formal reward for the capture of the Hatfields, dead or alive. Suddenly, this was no longer a family squabble. It was a state-sponsored manhunt. The feud was professionalized. Bounty hunters, known locally as pikes, began to appear in the Tugfork Valley, sniffing around for a chance at the reward money. For the Hatfields, their home was no longer a fortress but a trap. For the McCoys, it was a terrifying new reality, knowing that this escalation would surely be met with an even more violent response. The valley held its breath, waiting for the next shot to be fired. The state of Kentucky's bounty was not just a piece of paper, it was a hunting license. The law now had a face, and it was the face of a cold-eyed killer named Bad Frank Phillips. A relentless manhunter and a cousin to the McCoys, Phillips became the instrument of Perry Cline's legal war. He led posses into the heart of Hatfield territory, a place no lawman dared to go before. Gunfights erupted along the Tugfork, turning the feud from a series of ambushes into open guerrilla warfare. The valley became a place where every shadow could hide a rifleman. The Hatfields, led by the ruthless Jim Vance and the hot-headed Cap Hatfield, decided on a final, desperate gamble. On New Year's night, 1888, they would end the feud by erasing Randall McCoy himself. They crossed the river under the cover of a freezing winter night and surrounded the McCoy family cabin. They didn't knock. The first sound was the crackle of flames as they set the home ablaze to smoke out their quarry. What followed was a nightmare of chaos and gunfire in the flickering orange light. Randall McCoy managed to escape into the woods, but his family paid a terrible price. His daughter Alifair was shot down as she fled the burning home. His son Calvin was killed in the yard. His wife Sarah was brutally beaten, left for dead with a crushed skull. This single act of savagery was a fatal miscalculation. The New Year's night massacre horrified the nation. Newspapers from New York to San Francisco printed sensational stories of the lawless Appalachian War. The full weight of the law could no longer be ignored. Frank Phillips, now fueled by a cold fury, hunted down Jim Vance and killed him in a fierce shootout. One by one, the other members of the raiding party were captured and dragged in chains to the jail in Pikeville. The war was over. The trial was about to begin. Pikeville, Kentucky, transformed from a sleepy mountain town into an armed camp. The captured Hatfields and their allies were paraded through the streets, not just as prisoners, but as living symbols of the savage mountaineers the papers wrote about. The trial was a national spectacle. Reporters packed the courtroom, scribbling down every detail. Armed guards lined the walls, their presence a constant reminder that the feud was not truly over. The prosecution, led by Perry Cline, was determined to make an example of these men. The defendants sat in the courtroom, a mix of defiance and bewilderment. Most of them were just foot soldiers in a war started by older, more powerful men. The key to the prosecution's case was Ellison Cotton Top Mounts, the illegitimate and simple-minded son of the murdered Ellison Hatfield. Under interrogation, Cotton Top confessed to firing the shot that killed Hatfield-McCoy. Whether he was telling the truth, covering for others, or was simply coerced into a confession is a question historians still debate. For the jury, it was enough. The verdicts came down like hammer blows. Several of the men were sentenced to long years in the state penitentiary. But for Ellison Cotton Top Mounts, the sentence was death. On February 18, 1890, thousands of people crowded into Pikeville to witness the hanging. The scaffold stood stark against the Kentucky sky, the final monument to the bloodiest chapter of the feud. Cotton Top's last words were reportedly, "The Hatfields made me do it." But was it justice? Randall McCoy had won his legal battle, but he had lost everything else. Devil Anse Hatfield, the patriarch who ordered the first executions at the Paw Trees, was never arrested. He would die peacefully in his bed decades later. The law had spoken, but its voice seemed to ring hollow in the mountains, leaving only the ghost of a question. Was the hanging of one simple-minded man a triumph of justice, or just the final ugly act in a war where no one truly won? And what became of the two patriarchs who started it all? Randall McCoy, the man who lost everything, never recovered. He left the Tug Fork Valley, the land that held the ghosts of his children, and tried to start over. He ended his days operating a small ferry in Pikeville, a broken man haunted by memories. He died in 1914 after being badly burned in a cooking fire. A tragic, almost mundane end for a man whose life was defined by such epic violence. He was buried in the Dills Cemetery in Pikeville, alongside his wife Sarah and the children who were stolen from them. Across the river, Devil Anse Hatfield lived out his days as a legend in his own time. Untouched by the Kentucky warrants, he grew into a respected, almost revered elder. In a final, surprising twist, the man they called Devil was baptized in 1911, washing away his sins in the waters of Main Island Creek. He died of pneumonia in 1921, surrounded by his family. If you go to the Hatfield family cemetery in Logan County, West Virginia, today, you can still see his final act of defiance. A life-sized Italian marble statue of Devil Anse stands over his grave, watching over his clan, even in death, a powerful testament to the man who fought the law and won. The feud did not destroy the families. It forged them in fire. Today, the descendants of the Hatfields and McCoys are doctors, lawyers, judges, and even a former governor of West Virginia. They have moved far beyond the bloody legacy of their ancestors. In a remarkable act of reconciliation, the families began holding a joint reunion in 2000. Every year, they gather in Pikeville for a festival of peace and friendship, playing tug-of-war across the very river that once divided them. They share stories, shake hands, and symbolically sign a truce, declaring an official end to the hostilities. Yet the land itself refuses to forget. The Tug Fork Valley is now a tourist destination, with historical markers pointing out the site of Randall's burned cabin, the Paw Trees, and the place where Bad Frank Phillips shot Jim Vance. You can drive the roads and hike the trails where these men once hunted each other. The names Hatfield and McCoy have become a brand, stamped on everything from whiskey bottles to ATV trails. But if you stand quietly by the banks of the Tug Fork and listen past the hum of the tourists, you can almost hear the echoes of the past. The mountains remember the truth, even if the world has turned it into a story. So we come back to the question we asked at the very beginning. What really happened in the Tug Fork Valley? Was it all for a pig? No. The pig was just the excuse. Was it about the star-crossed love of Johnsy and Rosanna? No. They were just casualties. Their story, a single sad chapter in a much larger book. The truth, my friends, is that the Hatfield-McCoy feud was a war that began long before the first shot was fired. It was born in the divisions of the Civil War, fueled by the iron-willed pride of two patriarchs and ignited by a profound distrust in a system of law that seemed foreign and unfair. This story is a brutal lesson in what happens when honor curdles into vengeance and family loyalty demands a price paid in blood. It shows us how a community can turn on itself when it feels abandoned by the outside world, creating its own savage code of justice. It's a conflict that marks the violent transition from the old ways of the mountains, where a man's clan was his law, to the new world of courthouses and state lines. It's a testament to the fact that once the cycle of violence begins, it rarely ends with a winner. It only ends with graves. Today, the names Hatfield and McCoy are known across the world, often as a joke. But the real story is not a comedy. It is an American tragedy. It's a reminder that behind every legend there are real people with broken hearts, and behind every punchline there is a headstone. It's a story of hatred, yes, but it's also a story of the fierce, unyielding spirit of the Appalachian people. A spirit that could endure so much bloodshed and somehow, generations later, find its way back to forgiveness.